After The Exorcist III, a monumental course correction that washed away the stench of the heretic, you'd think that Morgan Creek Productions, the rights owners, would be careful not to sacrifice the gains they'd made. And you'd be right. Sort of. Paul Schrader, the celebrated screenwriter of Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and The Last Temptation of Christ, was brought aboard to direct The Exorcist, Dominion. Those three titles, combined properly, would seem like the perfect resume for the job. But he'd also directed the 1982 remake of Cat People, an endlessly ambitious but absurd failure that actually has more in common with The Exorcist II, The Heretic, than most people would like to admit. After The Exorcist III, a monumental course correction that washed away the stench of The Heretic, you'd think that Morgan Creek Productions, the rights owners, would be careful not to sacrifice the gains they made. And you'd be right, sort of. Hedging their bets, they hired Renny Harlin to direct Exorcist at the beginning. Harlin was a journeyman director well-suited to action films like Cliffhanger and horror comedies like A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4. The thought must have been that this type of prequel would have broad appeal to a general audience. Alright, so what we have here are two films that were produced to try and create a successor to The Exorcist Part 3. And moreover, they really were just trying to find a way to keep this IP alive. And that's kind of sad in its own way because The Exorcist works best as a fairly standalone project. It only worked a second time because William Peter Blatty was at the helm, and he created a distinctly different piece of art. It's here that both versions of a prequel to The Exorcist were doomed to fail. There's a checklist in both versions, and it's pretty obvious, all the little details that both versions have to have in them in order to satisfy the audience. Of course, this is the one franchise that probably doesn't have an audience that was demanding anything in particular. The fans love the first film, and a lot of the fans love the third film almost as much, if not as much, in some cases, even more. So why would we have to hit those expected scenes from the first or third films? The answer is we don't have to. It's hard to blame any of the actors or even the directors or writers of these films. The task itself was probably just too big. How to make something that legitimately enhanced what existed before and not come off as plotting and redundant. Schrader's version comes off a little bit worse in this equation, which is a little bit unexpected because he's a much better filmmaker than Renny Harlin. And I don't mean to downplay Renny Harlin there. Harlin is extremely good at what he does, but I don't think anyone would confuse him as being an important filmmaker. He's an entertainer, and there's something to be said for that. But this is just not the right franchise for that. John Borman didn't even make those mistakes with Exorcist II, The Heretic. He made a pretentious art film that is ultimately ridiculous because its eyes were bigger than its stomach. Renny Harlin's film is faster paced, although I still wouldn't call it a roller coaster ride. And it hits the marks it needs to hit to be like a dumb summer entertainment film. But that's not really what The Exorcist ever should be. Schrader's film does the unthinkable, though, because it manages to make The Exorcist boring. The first film and the third film, even at their most talky, are never boring, and we're always engaged in the stories and the characters, and everything feels important, and more importantly, it feels like you're being told a story that's relevant to our lives. That's simply not true in either case here. The question inevitably comes down to which film is better. The answer is they're both deeply flawed in very different ways, but yet the films feel so similar. It's almost as if you put Renny Harlin's film on 2/3 speed, you'd end up with Schrader's film. Or if your finger was heavy on the fast forward button watching Schrader's film, you'd end up with Harlin's film. And that's not to downplay the fact that there are significant differences in the two visions. But there's nothing necessarily preferable about either version. If you were raised on reality television and video games, Renny Harlin's film is the way to go. If, on the other hand, you're more of a PBS guy, then you probably want to give Schrader a chance. But either way, you're probably going to be disappointed. Because even though these films do apparently have fan bases, they're a distinct fan base from fans of the original or the original and the third film. This, of course, just is part of a larger conversation about whether franchises should even be the mainstay of the horror genre. The answer is maybe. But the better answer is in some cases, right? So if you're talking about endless films about a guy in a mask killing college-age teenagers, well, yeah, they should probably continue because it's the modern serial. It is a kind of television series almost. Whereas The Exorcist and The Exorcist 3 were films about something. There was a beginning, middle, and end specifically because that's the only way you can make a film about something. And that something was the key theological questions that have been plaguing mankind for at least the last 2,000 years. Probably before that, we just don't have a great history of it. So the problem of evil, the mystery of faith, the honor of martyrdom. These are important theological questions that were taken up in these two films. And this gives lip service to it. We get these scenes with Nazis and having to make hard choices and the complicity of evil and the human condition, but none of it really is deeper than the surface level, and none of it really works. By the end of both films, we get our demon and we get our exorcism, and we feel like we've seen it before in rip-offs of The Exorcist. It feels more like those later-day imitations, and not even gritty and kind of ferocious like some of the Italian rip-offs that followed the original film. This feels like more like the modern exorcism films that we've been getting, and it never really affected me watching either version at all. Does that mean you couldn't make another Exorcist film that would be as effective as the first or third film? Of course not. Great writers exist, great directors exist, great actors exist. And in the right combination, given the amount of time they'd need, and most importantly, given the right reasons to make a movie, I believe you could have another great Exorcist movie. The question is modern Hollywood conducive to that idea? Probably not. I haven't watched the television series that followed this. I'm not really a television guy. I don't like the open-ended, dramatic structure. But I will say this. Maybe that's where something like this belonged. If it wanted to be a continuation that we didn't need, maybe it didn't need to be on the big screen. I'm of the mindset that there comes a time and a place for these projects. And there's also an audience for everything. So I'm not telling anyone not to watch either of these movies. But go in with your expectations where they should be. And that is that you're not getting the original film and you're not getting Exorcist 3. What you will get are kind of typical Hollywood films. And that's something that the first and third films simply aren't. There's nothing typical about either of those movies. Maybe that makes both of these worse than The Heretic in a way, because at least that film swung for the fences and failed. While this is trying to connect, it's not looking to get more than just to first base. What does the future look like for The Exorcist? Will we see a remake of the original? Will we see another attempt to continue? It's hard to say. And it's not for me to say either, because I don't really have a dog in this fight. I like 2 of the 5 films quite a lot. And really, that's not really that bad of odds in the horror genre, where we have a lot more misses than hits with franchises. But what I would say is, I'm not holding my breath for any more. William Peter Blatty, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And without him, these films have a horrible track record. To be honest, I say let it lie. Because somewhere out there, there's a filmmaker ready to take up the reins to make something new and just as amazing.